Hello, this is Sally Ducharme. Thanks so much for joining me to talk about the astrology of an event that occurred on this day in history. On December 5th, 1945, just 60 years ago today, Flight 19 left a Navy base in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The flight consisted of 5 bombers who were on a training mission led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a veteran of 2,500 hours of flights during World War II. They would apparently have a routine mission for about the first hour, but things really went sideways after that. And the flight, all 5 bombers, all 14 men, would eventually disappear, and their remains were never discovered. So, what is remarkable about this story is that it continues to be brought up over the decades because the Flight 19 disappeared into an area of the ocean which later became known as the Bermuda Triangle. So I wanted to roll back to the actual flight itself and look at what was going on with the planets and aspects in the sky when the flight left Fort Lauderdale. Because the initiation of the journey is oftentimes like the birth. And so I like to use that chart. Like if you're starting on a trip, like when is your car pulling out of the garage? Or if you're getting ready to go to the airport, when are you walking out the door in order to get to the airport is a good initiation chart for the beginning of the journey. So we're looking at the chart for 2:10 in the afternoon. We know accurately that's when the flight took off. In fact, things went were a little confused and they left late because Lieutenant Taylor got lost on his way to the briefing and got disoriented because he hadn't been on the base before. So you can see that things were not going quite as they should right from the very beginning with this flight. But I don't often look at a chart before I start a trip, but I think if I had a flight planned with these aspects, I probably would change my ticket. You can see first off that a new moon had just formed the day before in the sign of Sagittarius, and it's resting in the ninth house of a chart of long distance journeys. And in Sagittarius, you think of going far, that kind of taking leaps into great distances. So the moon is dark, it still doesn't have any light in the sky. And so at this point, we've got the dark moon, the new moon in Sagittarius, but look what planet is kind of trapped within the dark of the moon, the planet of journeys, Mercury. And Mercury has several problems here. Number one, it's under the beams of the sun. That when Mercury rises and sets, it's invisible because the sun's light eclipses it. And so a planet that's under the beams of the sun is oftentimes kind of caught under the glare of the sun and can't really function as efficiently as possible. We also have Mercury retrograde at this time. It's retrograde going back into its conjunction with the sun. And so Mercury retrograde is another time when I think we all know Mercury retrograde situations where things don't always go as planned. It's almost like the universe has its own timetable when it comes to Mercury retrograde. But also, Mercury in Sagittarius is not in its most favorable position either. It's opposite the sign it rules, Gemini, so it's considered to be in detriment. And so in a Jupiter ruled sign, Mercury can sometimes be kind of confused about details. Mercury likes to be very linear, very specific, very detailed, but Jupiter tends to give like too much information. And so it's hard for that Mercury to sort things out. So we've got that Mercury then having those three things. It's under the beams, it's in detriment, and it's retrograde, caught in the dark of the moon. But also look to see what else is happening here. The moon is coming to meet the south node. which is another very fateful, it's a very fateful point where you think of the tide going out, the energy just washing away. And so that moon is going into kind of a void. There's less agency at the south node, more fatefulness. So we've got a very troubled stellium when Flight 19 took off, but look to see also what's happening with the stellium. It's opposite to Uranus in the third house. And notice also the third house is ruled by Gemini. So Mercury is its lord. And so we already talked about, the disabled quality of that Mercury. And you think about the third house as being things like plans, maps, navigation equipment, just how we move around. And so this disabled Mercury is ruling all of those things and communications, of course. And then Uranus is here, just showing something, could go awry in communications and navigational equipment, something that could create a crisis with Uranus there. So we've got all of those troubled spots in the chart, but also notice that Jupiter, which rules that Sagittarius stellium, seems to be okay here in Libra in the seventh house. But notice that it's approaching a square to Saturn. So Jupiter that likes to move forward, to have a mission, to just kind of launch itself out into the universe and accomplish great things. Universe has Saturn in the superior position of the square, kind of catching it by its tail and holding it back. Remember, if you want to find out who's going to win the battle in a square, picture yourself standing in the center of the chart looking at that square. The one on your right is the one who has a superior position. And so Saturn in this case is able to dominate Jupiter, taking its intent, its mission, and severely limiting it. Saturn brings limits. And notice that Saturn isn't in great shape either. It's retrograde, and it's also in the sign of Cancer, where it does not function well. It likes to be logical, and it likes to be slow and deliberate, very clear thinking. But, in the sign of Cancer, it's a water sign. So that sense of emotions and just uncertainty happening. So we've got then the ruler of the stellium, Jupiter, afflicted by this square to Saturn. But notice what else Saturn's doing in the chart. It rules the midheaven in Capricorn. And so you think about the midheaven being kind of the divine mission of the flight, what they were there to do, and that the ruler of that mission is itself severely disabled. And of course, whenever there's any sort of confusion and where the facts aren't clear, you want to look at Neptune, which tends to dissolve, take something that seems to be there and then it's not there. And you see it's functioning in a very prominent place in this chart. If you have any planet near the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, or IC, it's loud in the chart. And so that Neptune is particularly loud because it's just set. It's just moved down across the descendant, the horizon, the western horizon. And so Neptune is loud in this chart. It's also direct, so it is more effective in doing what Neptune does. But notice how it's placed in the chart. You're taking the mission and then the end of the matter, the IC, and it's applying to square both of them. So that throws more dust in the efforts of Flight 19 to accomplish its mission and to fly back home. And then finally, one last thing in this chart, which is very troublesome, is that Mars itself, you see how the S there tells us it's stationing. It's instead of moving forward in the sky, we want Mars to be moving forward so that we can carry out our activities, but Mars is stopped and it's getting ready to go retrograde. And so instead of, Mars kind of moving forward through Leo, it's starting to slip backwards. And it's eventually over the next weeks and months as they search for Flight 19, um, it's going to conjoin Saturn in this sign where it's not very happy in Cancer, suggesting again wateriness. And then just kind of the end of the matter. It's almost like the flight went into this void. And after the flight disappeared, another plane was sent to rescue, and that plane disappeared as well. And it carried 13 different people who were part of the rescue mission. And so 27 people perished on this day. And at first, the Navy investigated the flight, but they never were able to get a clear answer of what happened. They've tried to blame Lieutenant Taylor. They said he got disoriented, but Lieutenant Taylor's mother mounted a fierce campaign saying there's no evidence suggesting my son was responsible for the disappearance of Flight 19. And the Navy finally concluded that the cause of the disappearance of the flight was unknown. And so, nature abhors a vacuum. Um, Over the years, people would write about the disappearance of this flight and kind of look at the mystery of what had happened. But it wasn't until 1964 that someone actually coined the term the Bermuda Triangle. People had written about this area of the ocean. It's called a triangle because if you draw a line um, from Puerto Rico to Florida to the Bahamas, it forms kind of a triangle. And they've noted that other ships and aircraft had disappeared in this area of the ocean. And so they were thinking, um, there's something going on here. What is it? And so on February 1st, the February 1st issue of a magazine called The Argosy, which wrote about different phenomena, an author named Vincent Gaddis coined the term the Bermuda Triangle, and he cited Flight 19 as one of the uh, incidences that occurred in this kind of mysterious area of the ocean. So I was wondering, charts continue to live, and what was going on when um, the magazine was published, the article was published, and the Bermuda Triangle kind of lifted Flight 19's fate back into public attention. And so notice one thing that's happening at this time as Jupiter has come to its ascendant. So it's almost moved, it started out in Libra, it's almost moved into that 180-degree angle. And so you think about the ascendant as being the identity, the name. So Flight 19 was now given a name as, part of this phenomenon, the Bermuda Triangle. Notice too that Jupiter is in a nice trine to all the Sagittarian planets in the ninth house. So kind of giving it a boost, some recognition of what had happened on this flight. Another thing that's kind of an interesting fatalistic thing about the article being published at this time is that the nodal axis was exactly conjoining that midheaven IC, the mission of the chart. The south node is going over that midheaven, and the north node is going over the IC. So bringing into the world a nodal some sort of nodal aspect in your chart will often kind of bring something into being. So bringing into the physical world this magazine article. And we also notice too that Jupiter is in sextile to that third house Uranus. And so that through media, the story was communicated about Flight 19. But there's something else happening in this chart. If you we're looking at, remember, the Flight 19 chart on the inner wheel and the outer wheel the day that the magazine article was published. And we notice Pluto has come to a square to the sun. Pluto is now in Virgo, and it's having that conjunction with Uranus. This is kind of when the 60s kicked off, when Uranus and Pluto came together. In fact, 20 days later, the Beatles would appear on Ed Sullivan. So that kind of new energy was very much, and you think about that sort of looking at something that's a mystery, something that's deep, bringing popular interest and popular attention, Uranus. Very interesting how they're together just in square to our Sagittarian Sun and Mercury. And so when you look at Pluto in a square, you think, there is kind of a huckster energy to Pluto. It's digging deep into the earth to get wealth. There's a lot of that image when you think about Pluto. And so it's kind of interesting at this point that in bringing this topic of Flight 19 and calling it part of this Bermuda Triangle phenomenon sensationalized the story. It was less about investigating what happened and trying to reach the truth than in garnering all of these. Of course, back then it wasn't likes, but people buying magazine articles or buying magazines. So they were using it really to sell magazines, that kind of huckster energy of Pluto and Uranus squaring that Sun and Mercury of the original chart. And of course, we want to look at Neptune too, because I'm starting to think, okay, well, did they really shed any light on what happened to these, poor souls who disappeared nearly 20 years before then? Or were they just trying to raise kind of some sort of sensational interest in the topic? And so Neptune, you see, on this day when the magazine was published, is in square. The Sun and Mars are conjoined, and they're in square they're approaching a square to that Neptune, and Neptune itself has recently had a square from that Saturn. And again, looking at the square standing at the center of the chart, we see that Neptune has a superior position in this square. So this Uranian, this Aquarian effort to kind of disseminate this story has added that sort of Neptune, let's confuse things, let's create some sensation so that we can garner attention and make money. So that vibe, I think, is very clear in this chart too. And so the Bermuda Triangle then went on to be something people discussed over the next years and decades. And it really reached kind of critical mass when the book was published called The Bermuda Triangle. And so this happened 10 years later in 1974. And this was like an international bestseller. 20 million copies were sold. People went to movies and saw movies about it. There were documentaries, there were other books written. It was just like a huge thing. It became almost part of the lexicon. People would talk about something that disappears, vanishes into the Bermuda Triangle. And so, what was happening to our Flight 19 chart at this point when their story was kind of lifted into the stratosphere? And we see here that it was the same Pluto here has now moved into Libra and is now sitting on that Neptune in the chart. And remember, we had that kind of problematic position of Neptune in the original chart, and Pluto is now setting off that square between Neptune and the midheaven and the IC. So again, that huckster energy kind of coming to exploit the mystery of the failed mission of Flight 19. Then we also have Neptune has moved into Sagittarius, kind of helping us to believe some tall tales. Maybe you think about Neptune in Sagittarius. So Neptune has now moved into Sagittarius and it's approaching the sun of the Flight 19 chart. And over the next years, as the Bermuda Triangle becomes a worldwide phenomenon, we will see that Neptune will cross this Sagittarius stellium. And then another thing that's kind of fateful and one of those times when astrology kind of takes your breath away was that the nodal axis was doing a reversal. The north node was at the south node and the south node was at the north node. And so when this happens in our lives, it's almost like our lives takes a spin, that we're heading off in one direction and then for some reason we just head off in another with that nodal reversal. That something in our lives changes, um, but how that happens so much depends on our individual charts. But in this case of Flight 19, you see that it took that huge spin of becoming this international best-selling story that people all over the world knew about. It was a huge story. And so that's another way that, the transiting planets continue to light up this original chart of Flight 19 leaving Fort Lauderdale, Florida on December 5th, 1945. And fortunately, though, for those who perished in this flight, many people have come along to study what exactly happened on that day. And they've, without, having an axe to grind or trying to make money or create a sensation, came up with some very logical explanations for what had happened to Flight 19. They said that granted, the weather had gone really sideways after they left. They were in horrible conditions, very poor visibility. There was some evidence from people who had overheard communications from other flights that Flight 19 had lost its navigational and communication equipment. There was some sort of a failure there. And so they also thought that Lieutenant Taylor could have been confused. He had seen the Florida Keys and he thought that they were Bermuda. And so it had sent him flying off into the wrong direction out to open sea instead of back towards shore. And because this was supposed to be a 3-hour mission, they only had enough fuel to last for about 4 or 5 hours. So if they had gone out to open sea, they would have run out of fuel. And the fact that no remains were ever found was not, it could be logically explained that, it was a big ocean, it's strong currents in that area. It could have been, a cyclone coming through could have washed pieces away. And of course, the ocean dissolves things, back to our old friend Neptune. And while the Bermuda Triangle books kind of posited that there was some sort of paranormal phenomenon afoot, even connecting it to the lost continent of Atlantis and different electromagnetic poles. I think other people speculated about alien abduction. Lots of theories have been put out there about what happened, but there is that very kind of dry, sensible explanation. And then there are the wilder theories about what actually happened. Other scientists have actually looked at the Bermuda Triangle and said it's not, it's statistically, more ships and planes have not disappeared in that area than in other parts of the ocean. So, there's been a lot of buzzkill around the investigation of the Bermuda Triangle itself. And if we look back to that original chart of Flight 19, you can kind of see all those things in the chart. Kind of both sides of the story. We think about a disoriented pilot here, that Mercury in Sagittarius. Remember, we talked about how disabled it was, being under the beams and retrograde and in detriment. So Then also the failure of communication and navigational equipment, catastrophic Uranus in the third house of his chart could certainly explain that. And the bad weather, the terrible visibility, the confusion over what happened could also be explained by that Neptune, which remember is very prominent in this chart. But this is a good thing about astrology. Uh, you can look at it through different lenses. You could say that this disabled Mercury would tell us that the story would never be completely told, that there's more to the story than we realize. This Uranus in the third house could be there could be some explanation that's beyond the realms of our knowledge right now, because Uranus kind of is downloads information from a higher plane. And so there could be theories that evolve over time that may finally explain what happened to Flight 19. And of course, Neptune here, so prominent in this chart, could explain that there's more to this mystery than we're actually seeing, that more than we can imagine, even that unseen forces were at work on this day to cause Flight 19 to disappear forever. So, look at if I've piqued your interest in the disappearance of Flight 19 60 years ago today, do a little research and find out for yourself whether you choose to believe the more logical, earthbound explanations of what happened to the men on this flight, or if you believe that there's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophies. So take a look and make up your mind for yourself, but the astrology is there to help you. So thanks so much. I appreciate you joining me to explore this fascinating topic, and I'll see you again. Thank you. Bye.